The doors of the Dust Creek Saloon slammed open just as the evening piano fell silent. Every conversation stopped. A young woman stumbled inside, clutching the side of her face. Her dress was torn from days on the trail. Dust clung to her boots, and fear filled her tearful eyes. She looked around the crowded room filled with ranchers, gamblers, drifters, and deputies. Her trembling voice barely rose above a whisper. "Please, help me." Not a single soul moved. Everyone knew who was coming. Heavy footsteps echoed from outside. The town's ruthless cattle baron, Silas Boone, entered with 4 armed men behind him. His polished boots clicked across the wooden floor, as if he owned every inch of Dust Creek. In many ways, he did. Silas pointed toward the frightened young woman. "She's my property." No one challenged him. The bartender lowered his head. The piano player quietly closed the lid. Even the sheriff looked away. The young woman, Emma Carter, had escaped Boone's isolated ranch after months of forced labor following her father's mysterious death. Her father had refused to sell his small ranch to Boone, and only weeks later he was found dead beneath what the town called an unfortunate accident. Emma knew better. She had fled with the land deed hidden inside the lining of her jacket, the one document proving Boone had stolen half the valley through fraud. Boone smiled. "You embarrassed me, Emma." He raised his hand and struck her hard enough to send her crashing against a table. The room remained frozen. Emma struggled to her knees. Again she cried, "Please, somebody—" Silence. Boone grabbed her arm and dragged her across the floor. "Anyone else feeling heroic today?" He laughed. 4 rifles instantly pointed toward the crowd. No one dared breathe. Then a chair scraped across the floor. Slowly, deliberately, from the darkest corner of the saloon stood a man no one had noticed. Black hat, weathered duster, a revolver resting low on his hip. His beard hid part of the scar stretching from his temple to his jaw. The bartender's face turned pale. Someone whispered, "It can't be." Another man muttered, "That's Colt Maddox." The name spread through the room like wildfire. Colt Maddox, the outlaw every bounty hunter chased, the cowboy who robbed crooked railroad payrolls, the man newspapers called the Devil of Wyoming. Yet nobody mentioned that every dollar he stole somehow found its way into orphanages, struggling ranches, and widows left with nothing. Colt calmly picked up his coffee cup, finished the last sip, set it down. "You done?" he asked quietly. Boone laughed. "This doesn't concern you." Colt's eyes shifted toward Emma. "It does now." The entire saloon held its breath. Boone sneered. "You know who I am?" Colt tipped his hat. "No." A pause. "But I know bullies." Boone's men drew their guns. 5 revolvers. 1 outlaw. The room exploded into panic. But Colt never reached for his weapon. Instead, he took 1 slow step forward, then another. His voice remained calm. "If you boys are drawing iron, you'd better mean it." Every outlaw in the room recognized something Boone didn't. Colt wasn't afraid. He was measuring distances, watching reflections in the whiskey mirror, counting footsteps, calculating every move before anyone else had even blinked. Emma stared at him in disbelief. Why would the most wanted outlaw in the territory risk his life for someone he'd never met? She didn't know. Neither did anyone else. But before the night was over, Dust Creek would witness a gunfight people would tell stories about for generations, and Emma would discover that Colt Maddox had a reason for helping her, a reason buried 20 years in the past, one connected to her father's greatest secret, and to the promise Colt had made over a dying man's grave. The promise. The saloon was so quiet that even the ticking of the old clock could be heard. Silas Boone laughed. 1 outlaw against 5 armed men? You've lost your mind. Colt Maddox didn't smile. He simply answered, "No, you've lost yours." Boone's men tightened, their grip on their revolvers. The first man fired. The blast shattered a whiskey bottle instead. Before anyone understood what had happened, Colt had kicked over a poker table. It spun across the floor, knocking 2 gunmen off balance. Colt drew his revolver with lightning speed. 1 shot. A rifle flew from a man's hands. 2nd shot. A lantern burst above another outlaw, showering sparks and forcing him backward. Third shot. A revolver spun across the wooden floor. Not one bullet struck a man. Colt never fired to kill unless there was no other choice. Within seconds, 3 of Boone's men were disarmed. The remaining 2 hesitated. They had heard stories about Colt Maddox. Now they believed them. Boone shouted, "Cowards! Shoot him!" None moved. Colt stepped between Boone and Emma. "She's leaving." Boone's face turned crimson. "You don't know what she's carrying." "I know exactly what she's carrying." Emma looked up in surprise. You know?" Colt nodded. "Your father told me." The room fell silent. Boone frowned. "That's impossible." Colt's eyes hardened. "The night your father was murdered, I was there." Emma gasped. "My father wasn't alone." Colt lowered his head. "He saved my life." 20 years earlier, Colt had not been an outlaw. He had been a young ranch hand, falsely accused of robbery. A mob chased him through the mountains. It was Emma's father, Thomas Carter, who hid him in his barn, treated his wounds, and helped him escape. Before Colt rode away, Thomas said, "If anything ever happens to my family, promise you'll protect them." Colt had shaken his hand. "I give you my word." Years later, Colt learned Thomas had been killed. He searched for Emma, but always arrived too late. "Until tonight." Boone laughed bitterly. "So that's why you're here?" He slowly pulled a hidden pistol from behind his back. Emma screamed. "Colt!" The shot rang out. Colt turned at the last second. The bullet grazed his shoulder. He stumbled but stayed on his feet. Before Boone could fire again, the sheriff finally stood. He looked around the saloon. For the first time in years, the townspeople weren't afraid anymore. One rancher stepped forward, then another. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, the bartender. Soon nearly everyone in the room stood beside Colt. The sheriff drew his badge. "Silas Boone, you're under arrest for murder, fraud, kidnapping, and attempted murder." Boone laughed. "You've never had the courage before." The sheriff replied quietly, "I borrowed someone else's tonight." Boone tried to run. He never reached the door. His own men dropped their weapons. Without Boone's money, they had nothing worth fighting for. The final chapter. Weeks later, the truth spread across Wyoming. The hidden land deeds proved Boone had stolen dozens of ranches. Families who had lost everything finally got their land back. Emma inherited her father's ranch. Neighbors who had once been too frightened to help now came every day to rebuild the fences, repair the barn, and plant new crops. Dust Creek was becoming a town again. But one morning, Colt's horse was already saddled. Emma found him tightening the saddle straps. "So you're leaving?" Colt nodded. "My kind doesn't stay in places like this." "You could." He smiled faintly. "No." She stepped closer. "You kept your promise." "I was 20 years late." "You still came." Colt reached into his saddlebag and handed her an old leather journal. "It belonged to your father." Inside were letters Thomas had written over many years. On the final page were the words, "Emma, if you're reading this, then someone good kept his promise. Trust him the way I trusted him." Tears filled Emma's eyes. She looked up. But Colt was already climbing into the saddle. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked toward the distant mountains. "Somewhere there's another person waiting for help." Emma smiled through her tears. "Then you'll always have a home here." Colt tipped his black hat. "I know." He rode away as the morning sun rose over the valley. The people of Dust Creek watched in silence. The outlaw, who had arrived as the most wanted man in Wyoming, left without asking for money, land, or praise. He wanted only one thing: to keep a promise made to an honest rancher many years before. From that day on, whenever travelers stopped in Dust Creek and asked about the quiet ranch at the edge of town, the locals would smile and say, "That place stands because one outlaw remembered his word." And in the Old West, there was no treasure more valuable than a promise kept.